Welcome to Crossing Faiths, the largest multi-faith podcast out there. I'm John Pinna, and today I have an old friend, John Kiriakou. So to come in and we'll spend some time with me. Former CIA, now a media guru, and out there, I see all your assessments on all the things that go on, and you and I had operated in multiple theaters and tangentially sort of interact with each other through other people, like they say. Yeah. I wanted to, I invited you on to because I sent you my assessment of intelligence assessment of the events surrounding the Holy Week, and we decided to table that for a later date because I felt compelled to ask you about the meeting between Trump and Zelensky in the Vatican, and that from an intelligence perspective, it's just an amazing moment in time because you and I espouse very similar views about how direct diplomacy is really gone by the wayside, but now it's kind of front and center. And so maybe you could, let's just start off with, this meeting happened. The two of them are sitting in these sort of famous pictures now, face to face, very intimate. And what is that from if you put your intelligence hat on, and this sort of picture found its way to your desk at the CIA, right? You were gathering, all the components of that event. How would you proceed to gather, but then on top of that, assess what's going on?
I think you have to assess it based on what we already know about interactions between Zelensky and Trump. Everybody saw that Oval Office performance when Zelensky went to meet with Trump and J.D. Vance and received a dressing down that was really unprecedented in the last generation or two. And it was unprecedented not just because Donald Trump humiliated Zelensky in that venue, which was public, because this was the part of the Oval Office photo op where they're supposed to be chatting about the weather. Right. As the media take their pictures, and then the media is escorted out, and then they can really go at each other. Trump went after Zelensky with the media there. He did it on purpose. Yeah. One of the things that really struck me, and like you, I have long experience. I was 15 years at the CIA. I was another 3 years at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I've gone through many of these kinds of events, and they're always pro forma. Yeah. But not only did Trump lash out at Zelensky, he allowed Vance to lash out at Zelensky. And I got to tell you, since the 1980s, when I was privy to this kind of information, I've never seen a vice president speak in an event like this. It's not their position to speak. It's their position to sit quietly and nod.
Yeah, I was shocked when that happened, and I go, I don't even know how Vance wandered into the conversation and wandered out. I go, how is that possible?
Which then should tell us, and this is my analysis that I think you would agree with. This was a setup from the get-go, and Vance was playing the role that he was assigned by Trump. Yeah. So they ganged up on him. So with that as background, the Pope dies. Trump initially won't confirm who is going to make up the U.S. delegation. He ends up leading the U.S. delegation, which frankly kind of surprised me. I just assumed that Vance would because he was already there and he's Catholic. But Trump went and had this private meeting with Zelensky. Now, private here is the operative word, right? Because what was supposed to be a private meeting at the Oval Office really never took place. Remember, Zelensky was thrown out of the Oval Office and summoned his limo and took off. This was actually a private meeting, and all we really know about it is that they sat there and talked. We don't know what they said because we aren't privy to it. That also was done on purpose. But I think, and please feel free to disagree with me, I think that Zelensky was so cowed by his treatment in the Oval Office that he probably assumed a subservient position even in the private conversation. I think he's a little bit afraid of Trump. We know, for example, that Vladimir Putin has said, both privately and publicly to the Russian media, that he prefers to deal with Trump because they're closer on these issues than Putin has been with Democrats. But Trump is so unpredictable,
right,
that it makes the whole thing just a guessing game.
right.
I think Zelensky probably has come to the same conclusion. Like, do
Right.
you risk pissing him off? Do you risk disagreeing with him? Do you risk what little aid he has vowed to continue to your country? Or do you just nod and say, yes, Mr. President?
Right. Yeah. I think that, you have Putin, who has a country behind him. Zelensky has a country behind him. But he's just very open. He's like, listen, I stay the course. Presidents change, and we have to maintain our policy.
That's
And,
right.
that's, in the halls of the intelligence community, the IC, you have, that sort of mantras on the wall. It's like the Russians going to stay their course. They're going to plan 25 years out. That's who they are. And then you have Zelensky. He's got the country behind him, but he's relying on the U.S. aid. He also, there's Trump 1.0, which he interacted with, then Biden, and now Trump 2.0. And I think that transition has been very difficult for him to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
And you had a lot of shenanigans with, the laptop and Biden's son. And I think Zelensky navigated that in a probably a really good way with the Biden administration, but he wasn't thinking about the change in guard if that happened.
Agreed.
How do you see that sort of the personal sort of vignettes?
That's a great question. That's a great question, because we see pretty clearly now where Zelensky dropped the ball. Yeah. Zelensky dropped the ball because he either didn't think Trump was going to win again, or he discounted the change in opinion among Republican elected officials. Yeah. Most Americans are neocons or neoliberals, whether they even realize it or not, whether they know what those words mean or not. When our government tells us we have to send troops overseas, or we have to send arms overseas or weapon systems because we're the good guys and the other side are the bad guys, we just say, USA, USA. And that's changed in the Republican Party. The Republican Party is far more populist now, far less interventionist. The Dick Cheneys are gone. They're out of power. John Bolton is watching from the sidelines. Yep. And I think that Zelensky just didn't have an appreciation for, number one, how the Republican Party has changed, and number two, the likelihood of Donald Trump winning a non-consecutive second term as president. I mean, that hasn't happened since 1880.
Yeah.
So he didn't expect it to happen. And now he's caught with his pants down, because not only do the Republicans control the White House, but they control both houses of Congress. And those blank checks that the Biden administration was sending to the Ukrainian government, those are over.
Yeah, and there's also a miscalculation of egos.
Yes.
There's been an elevation of Zelensky with obviously doing his world tour, going out and hero, and then you have Trump's ego, right? So both have elevated egos. One is long-standing, and one is he's sort of a nouveau ego, So it's brand new, sort of. But then you also have this our internal politics, which and the global politics is sort of an overlay where it's Zelensky is being cast as this good guy, this hero behavior, and Trump is still a villain, regardless of the fact that he's holding the purse strings, right? He's got all and so that political mapping, maybe you can unpack that a little bit about how it's looked at, because I've seen a lot of slogans floating around, and I'm going, but direct engagement is really good. This is Camp David type stuff. We didn't know what was going on in Camp David. I mean, Carter did all that business, and all these presidents. Reagan had called Gorbachev, would call the premiers and say, look, cut your shenanigans out here, and we're gonna do a side deal that no one's gonna really know about, but we won't bring our subs so close to Archangelsk next time, or the Kamchatka Peninsula. Just make sure you pull these guys out, or don't. And so that direct engagement is so important. You and I both believe in that. I mean, human is your business. It's at our business, what we do. So the importance of that direct engagement, and then you have, like I said, this backdraft of these political agendas behind it. So how do you balance that from an intelligence perspective?
Yeah, there's a long history of direct engagement, and president after president has made great use of Camp David. I mean, first of all, look at the Camp David peace accords between Egypt and Israel. It's been a success. It's been a tense success, but it's been a success. Then you've got well, let's look at the peace negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the final week of the Clinton administration. There's a story that I've told a number of times. A dear friend of mine from the CIA, my first boss at the CIA, was the senior director at the National Security Council for the Middle East, and he participated in those face-to-face talks at Camp David. It was Shimon Peres leading the Israeli side, and Yasser Arafat leading the Palestinian side. During the final week of the Clinton administration, they were at Camp David. My boss told me that they had this enormous map of Jerusalem sitting on the conference room table, and with a Sharpie, they're dividing Jerusalem block by block, right? And then they finished. And Al Gore said, "We have peace." And Arafat said, "I could never sell this to the Palestinian people." And he walked out. And Gore ran after him and said, "Wait a minute, you can't just walk out. If there's something that you don't like, say it, and we'll negotiate an agreement." And he said, "I'll never be able to sell any peace deal to the Palestinian people." And he quit, and there wasn't peace.
Sure.
I mean, it was that close. And there's no downside to talking. Look at what Donald Trump did with the North Koreans. The Democrats practically had a collective stroke over Donald Trump engaging directly with the North Koreans, saying they legitimized Kim Jong-un. Donald Trump welcomed him into the international community. Yeah, so what? It's better to talk than to not talk. I remember that when I was at the CIA, we used to have this joke that during the George W. Bush administration, we had never seen people work so hard to not talk to our enemies.
Right.
Like they really worked hard, leveling sanctions against other countries, never engaging in direct conversations.
Right.
And I want to add one other thing about Donald Trump, and I may be completely wrong on this, but I think I'm right. Donald Trump absolutely hates that Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize. Hates it. So do I, frankly. Because he didn't deserve it. He only won it because he wasn't named George W. Bush. But Trump desperately wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. There are no talks with North Korea. So the next best thing is talks with Iran.
Sure.
And so he wrote this letter to Ayatollah Khamenei, who first said, "No, I never got any letter," and then said, "Yeah, I got a letter. We're not taking it seriously." And then within days, they announced talks in Muscat.
Sure.
They're in the middle of the third round of talks right now. The first round the talks were indirect. The Omani foreign minister is shuttling between two conference rooms at the Omani foreign ministry. The Iranians are in one, the Americans are in another. The first round, they ended up taking a picture together, which was a very important step. They met a week later in Rome indirectly. That was a success. Now technical experts are meeting also indirectly and again in Muscat. I don't pay attention to what comes out of the State Department on these issues. And I want to talk about that in a second too. I pay attention to what's coming out of the Iranian foreign ministry, because I have found that the Iranians are more direct in their assessment of these kinds of meetings than the Americans are. And the Iranians are saying, "Oh my God, this may actually turn into something." The statements coming out of the Iranian foreign ministry have been universally positive so far. Universally positive. And JT, we used to have this phrase. You're just about as old as I am. You'll probably remember it. In the 70s, people said only Nixon could go to China,
Right.
because Nixon was the most anti-communist, the most anti-Chinese
Sure.
president in American history. And
Yeah.
then he makes a trip to China. He gives Mao 2 buffaloes and a Lincoln Continental. Mao gives us 2 pandas, and we all live happily ever after.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, maybe only Trump could go to Tehran.
Yeah. Well, the open communication is so
It's it's like a no-brainer.
yeah. Why
There's
aren't you?
no downside.
Well, and you know the problem is you have diaspora in just with the Iranians. You have diaspora that's been
Oh,
advocating
that's an
and
important point.
and these are all people that in '79 lost everything, but we're also part and parcel to the regime. I mean, I've been in those meetings with like people that say, we're going to restore, the shot, the shot,
Yeah.
the sons and daughter, we're going to do this, and I'm going, God, froze. I was raised. My great grandfather died when I was 10. I was raised. Indo Greek was my first language. I was raised by my grandparents.
Wow.
So when I speak Indo Greek in Afghanistan, I speak like an old man because he left in
Yeah.
1896. I don't even know the
Yeah.
word sometimes.
I spoke in 1930s era Greek slang when
Right.
I went to formal, Greek training.
Right. And so here I am. And my Russian is Soviet Russian, right? So
Yeah,
I want to say
of
Tavares
course.
instead of my drug. I don't want to say my friend. I want to say, comrade. So
Yeah.
that's what I want to say, And so all the diaspora here, the Iranian diaspora, is frozen in time, and they are the advisors, and that's the problem. Is like if you don't have direct contact, then all we're doing is looking backwards into this old thinking. And so you have an opportunity with direct engagement, even to our enemies, just to say, hey, what are you thinking over here? What's going on?
Yeah.
You guys got all this petrol we wanted. You guys got a flourishing pharmaceutical industry. You want to know what? Maybe we could tap into that. Let's not destroy these beautiful buildings. How do we figure this out? But no two people are talking like that, and we're working. It's all through proxy and proxy and proxy. And that term chatter.
Yeah.
Too much information, and you don't know how to what's the right and what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big icy term.
You bet it is.
FDR libraries right down the road here.
That's funny.
Yeah. And so I interned there. I was I worked there, and when I was in college, and then I did an exchange during the Yeltsin years. I'm the only American that was that worked in Russian archives. Imagine that. And I said, I went to the guy and I said, so where is it? And he goes, what? And I go, Hitler, where is it? And he goes, what? He's like, you want to see him? And we went to, and they pulled out a box, and but in any event, what's that?
They still have him.
Well, there's some controversy.
Pieces of him.
Skull.
Yeah, I've heard about the skull, that it's been on various directors' desks over the years.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah, who knows? But it was one of those things where it's like, how cool is it that they have? There's, anyways, the spoils of war.
I love that.
What a pivotal moment. But the thing is that there's always this controversy at the FDR library where they talk about FDR knew that the Japanese were going to attack, right? Yeah. And I always say, look, there's so much chatter, there's so much information. How do you discern what's going on? So there is a document that says that the Japanese will attack at this moment, and it's sort of like a smoking gun. But when you look at all the other credible sources there, the problem is there's not enough to discern what is and what isn't real.
There's absolutely right.
22 documents that say they're going to attack at this date. And if you have your readiness up, you just burn through, obviously your defense spending. So the challenge is like, if you don't have direct engagement, then you're only reliant on, all these different sources, and what's credible and what isn't credible, it oscillates, right, back and forth. Mm-hmm. So this direct engagement is so important. Zelensky and like now the Iranians, it's really important, because working on stale, antiquated information or people with agendas is going to put us in a bad position.
I think you're exactly right. I think you're exactly right. And the thing that's funny to me too is it seems like we're the ones who push back against offers to engage directly. That it's not the other side. Look at Putin, for example. Putin's position has been consistent on this. He's like, sure, we'll talk. We'll talk to anybody. We won't necessarily come to an agreement.
Sure.
But we're always willing to talk.
Yeah.
And the United States isn't. We come up with these positions, and then just on principle, we stick with those positions irrationally. We don't talk to the Cubans. Why? Just because. That's the policy. We don't talk to until recently, the Iranians. We don't talk to the Chinese. Even Trump said the other day that we were talking to the Chinese about about trade and tariffs, and the Chinese said, no, we're not. We offered, but we never got a message. And the reporter yesterday said, well, the Chinese deny that we're talking. And Trump said, they're lying. And the reporter said, well, who is it that's talking? And Trump said, I can't tell you, it's a secret.
Right.
Well, what the heck is that supposed to mean?
Yeah.
And doggone it, I hate when they make me want to believe the Chinese.
Well, here's, it's I think the thing is it's about, everybody wants predictability and control, right? That's kind of, and I know, it's very difficult. I remember, so my first sort of experience with international diplomacy was at the FDR site when the summit, the Yeltsin
oh sure,
summit.
Clinton. Mm-hmm.
And so I was low level staff. I spoke Russian, so they gave me they paired me with a Russian guy, and one of the, I just remember the IC just going completely insane because Clinton wouldn't go through the prescribed doors.
For God's sake.
It was always, there was like this door, and I just remember this big blowout continuously because he and Yeltsin would sort of sneak out a door and then go for a walk.
Yeah, they genuinely liked each other.
Right. And it was just we're talking hyper security. We're talking about, guys in the trees, I was like, what's that guy doing up? But whatever, guys in the tree. And so there, obviously it was safe. But the president, they were so aggravated that he was just making decisions on the fly. And that ability to be mobile and to adapt and then create the environment, which is what that picture sort of shows of Zelensky and Trump, where it's just like, all right, let's just pull, they're not sitting in, throne chairs. They're sitting in just, those chairs that you use for weddings, and they just pulled them up and they got really close and they're like, listen, what are we going to do here?
Yeah.
And even if there's some kind of ego or power component or all these different things, the reality is that there's nothing, if you and I are sitting face to face and we're just chatting a little bit, I remember us going to Sette, the Italian restaurant that's on Connecticut. And after we had chatted a little bit, and there's no substitute to just sitting there and having a bowl of pasta being like, oh, what's happening here? What's going on with the kids? What's happening with, they had that conversation at length. And so the value is amazing, but the bureaucracy hates the lack of control. The technocrats hate the lack of control. I mean, this is a hallmark of your career post CIA, right? Is the idea of like, you have this whole bulwark that is trying to create predictability and trying to pursue policy or steer policy, right?
Yes.
And it's mostly asymmetrical in how it approaches elected officials, because he can't just, and then you have an elected official that says, I'm going to go through this door, we're going to sit down and we're going to do this. And before you know it, everybody's going, what are they doing? What is going on? And you can imagine around them is this swirl, right?
Yeah.
Maybe, just like I said, what's your take on that? Like what's going on in the halls of government right now? They call it the deep state or whatever you want, but I don't necessarily go to terminology, but the idea it's happening in this administration right now, no one really knows what the conversation was. There's no, because no one, you know what I mean? And so,
you're right.
So now they're turning their powers on the White House right now to go, what do we do? How do we support this in a way that enforces US policy or our agenda? But the reality is like, we just don't know. So
we don't know. And I'll tell you, the answer that I'm going to give you is vastly different, probably the opposite of what it would have been 8 years ago. Because Donald Trump 8 years ago, for all his talk, surrounded himself with neocons, right? He had Mike Pompeo, first as CIA director and then as Secretary of State. He had bloody Gina Haspel as CIA director. He had John Bolton as the longest serving national security advisor.
Yeah.
The people who really were anathema to what he campaigned on in the
Sure.
2016 election. So I think he learned that lesson. That's why Marco Rubio has literally nothing to do with the Iran talks. This is Steve Witkoff.
Yeah.
Or Wyckoff. How do you say it? Wyckoff. Why isn't the Secretary of State, of all people, in charge of these talks? It's because he's a neocon. And he got that position because the appointment pacified an element of the Republican Party that needed pacification. But he's also young, and he's not strong enough. How should I say it? Not strong enough politically to be able to stand up to Donald Trump independently.
Sure.
So it's kind of a great little balancing act that's going on there. Now
it's also not unique, right?
Not unique. Not at all unique. You're right.
There was the Hopkins mission to Russia that negotiated Lend-Lease, and Hopkins was the head of the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority.
You are absolutely correct.
But FDR could trust him, so he said, "I'm going to pull you because I know you're going to push this. You're going to follow policy." So I wanted to just make sure, like, that's not unique, right? Harry Hopkins was the Hopkins mission to Russia. I mean, here's a guy for the Tennessee Valley Authority on a plane to Russia, and he's thinking, "What am I supposed to be doing?" He goes, "You negotiate these three things. You give him petrol, you give him Lend-Lease, and doesn't matter. And you push the second front. You don't even talk about that. For a while.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, right. So it's not. I'm sorry to interject, but that's
this happens. This happens all the time.
Sure. Yeah.
I'll tell you a story, JT.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think I'm okay telling this story. So I was serving in Bahrain from 1994 to 1996, and I was the economic officer, very tiny embassy. But as the economic officer, I was very busy because Bahrain at the time was the Middle East's banking center. So there was a group that was active there called the Bahrain U.S. Banking Society.
Okay.
Whole bunch of American bankers that were all assigned to Bahrain. And then, of course, the heads of the Bahrain banks and, they would get together and drink and have dinner and parties and stuff. It was nice. They announced one day that they are giving a Lifetime Achievement Award to David Rockefeller. And so the ambassador announces that we're going to have this big dinner. It's going to be hosted by His Highness the Emir. It's going to be at the Royal Palace. The entire cabinet's going to be there. Bring your wives. And it's to honor David Rockefeller and his Lifetime Achievement Award. So a couple of weeks pass. It's the night of the dinner. We go, and there's a receiving line. It's the Emir and the Prime Minister and the Crown Prince, and then this one and that one, and David Rockefeller and all these people. So we shake hands. I happened to be a subscriber of Art News magazine at the time, and he had just gotten this big award in the art world for, 50 years of philanthropy and humanitarianism. So I congratulated him on his art award. He lit right up, and I love art so much. And I was like, yeah, I know, you owned everything that's in the Museum of Modern Art. So he leaves a couple days later, and we're in the morning meeting in the ambassador's office. We met every morning at 9 o'clock, and the ambassador said, boy, that Rockefeller visit went very smoothly, very well. The Bahrainis were very appreciative. They're still talking about it. And I said, because I'm an idiot, I said, why would David Rockefeller fly halfway around the world at his age to collect an award from an organization that he probably has never heard of? That doesn't make any sense to me. The ambassador says, he goes, John, you're supposed to be the smart one here. And everybody laughed. I said, what am I missing? He's like, he didn't come here to collect the stupid award. He's the secret back channel to Saddam Hussein. This was his cover stop. And so when he left Bahrain, he didn't go back to New York. He went to Baghdad.
Yeah.
And told Saddam Hussein, you better stop or we're going to bomb the shit out of you again.
Right.
And then he flew back through Amman.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, how could I be so stupid? Of course
Yeah.
he was the secret back channel. So it's a common thing.
Happens all the time,
Happens all the time.
Yeah.
Nixon loved using businessmen as back channels. He had back channels to the Cubans, to the Ethiopians, all over
Yeah.
the world. He was sending businessmen and friends. You remember Ronald Reagan had what was called the kitchen cabinet. He had his cabinet in Washington. He had his kitchen cabinet
Yeah.
in California, and it was the likes of what was his name? R.L. Grace, I think, Grace Industries.
Yeah.
Yeah. And all these billionaires that he surrounded himself with, that would make a very quiet trip to the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia,
Yeah.
the Middle East to talk to the Iranians, New
If you
York to talk to the Palestinians.
if you have a reason to be in proximity, then with someone that already has that relationship, you
Yeah,
can
it's
get
like,
there.
oh, look who I bumped into,
Yeah.
Oh, I just bumped into the Iranian foreign minister. Wow, what a coincidence.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and here's the thing: it's between Zelensky and Trump, for example. They already have a long history together. It's not.
Yes.
It's natural for them to bump into each other. It's natural for them to grab two chairs and sit there and say, okay. They've had some ups and downs, right?
Right.
They talk about the White House meeting,
That's
and it
right.
was a hit job. I mean, no doubt. I mean,
Oh my God, yes.
you've been in those meetings where it's your boss turns around and says to you, you want to know what? I'm going to need you to sharpshoot on this one because I got to play the good guy, or I got to do this. You're gonna do, and you've done that. I know I've done that in meetings where
Absolutely.
I'm sitting there going, and then I leave the meeting and I go, that guy just hates me, and he doesn't realize that
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
he doesn't realize what we're trying to do here, and
Absolutely true.
and so I think that there's an element in what happened that's there's an innocence behind it because there's an opportunist element behind it, but then you have this backdrop of the Vatican, which you have not the bureaucracy, but the idea of this the Pope who he didn't live in the Pope's residence. He lived in this smaller sort of residence, and is it the
That's right.
Curio? Is it called
Yes.
the Curio? I think he made sure that he got out of that bureaucracy. There's a lot of symbolism.
He also didn't take a salary.
Right? Yeah.
He was entitled. I just read this the other day. He was entitled to 340,000 euros a year, and he didn't take any of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had a different persona, different. He had a presence about him that was different than previous popes or our recent popes, and so there's maybe you read into it a little bit, but there's an opportunity there. But they have a history and a relationship, Zelensky and Trump. But then you also have this Catholic backdrop, particularly of the Pope's funeral, which in weird ways sort of facilitated this. Right? There's everybody came while. I think a lot of the pundits and a lot of the people are talking about he wore a blue suit and it was disrespectful. And I'm going,
Right.
How many times have you gone to an event where you're just not sure what is or isn't,
Yeah, right. You just don't know.
If I wore my cultural clothes, everybody would be praising me, even though that's not in alignment with a suit. But the fact is something extraordinary happened, right? You have direct engagement, and it's flawed. It's not easy to unpack, and it's also very, very uncomfortable for a lot of people because there's the lack of control.
Yeah.
So what's going on in the halls of the IC right now? Are they freaking out?
Well, think on Ukraine probably.
Yeah.
I think on Israel they are furious, and we can get into that. But
why
because the CIA has never been pro-Israel, never.
Okay.
I hate when I see people comment. Like I posted something the other day, and some idiot from I don't know where, from Europe someplace, commented that CIA and MI6 are Zionist-controlled entities. It's like, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
No.
That's just simply not true. In fact, it's the opposite that's true. That even at the State Department, they aren't pro-Israel. It's Capitol Hill that drives the relationship.
Yeah, That's true.
And they pull the White House along with them.
Yeah.
But Ukraine is different. You know, at the CIA, and listen, I've been out for 20 years. It's been a long time, 21 years. It's been a long time, but I can tell you institutionally that the CIA hates Russia. They just they hate Russia. Even when I was there, when I was still there, I was I had this like mantra that even if we have poor relations with Russia, we can still cooperate on things like counterterrorism, counter narcotics, counter proliferation.
Sure.
And people are like, "Are you crazy? They're the gravest threat to America today." I'm like, "What newspapers are you reading?"
Yeah. In what sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not seeing it. And
Yeah.
and 20 years later, I'm still not seeing it.
Yeah.
See, this is what happens though when you refuse to engage. This is what happens when you turn immediately to sanctions every time another country does something that you don't like.
Yeah.
You know, sanctions to the point where sanctions are meaningless. I
Yeah.
have a very dear friend, close friend, who is Iranian American and who goes to Iran twice, 3 times a year. And she sends me videos, she sends me pictures, and she has shown me that the Iranians lack for nothing. They
Yeah.
have robust trade relations with Russia, with India, with China.
Yeah.
They don't need anything from us. And they've gotten around sanctions because we've had sanctions on them for 46 years. And whatever they can't buy from the Russians, Indians, or Chinese, they just make themselves.
Sure. Yeah.
And so the sanctions have come to mean nothing, nothing.
Yeah.
You know, look at sanctions on Venezuela. We hurt ourselves as much as we hurt the Venezuelans because Venezuelan oil is the dirtiest oil in the world. It has the highest sulfur content. And until just 2 years ago or so, that dirty oil could only be refined in Texas. Okay, yeah. Nowhere else. Well, guess what? Because we have these crushing sanctions on Venezuelan oil because we don't like their politics. The Chinese built a refinery in the Caribbean, and now Venezuelan oil is refined by the Chinese. So we've lost all that business and all that oil, and all of that oil had been refined in the U.S. And we purchased most of it. Now it's all gone.
Yeah,
so we only hurt ourselves.
Yeah, I think that there's you know, the path forward. You know, like when I think the chessboard is changing a little bit. We're at the beginnings of the Trump administration, so we've got 3 more years.
Yeah,
so there's an opportunity where it comes with this direct engagement to actually start solving some of the problems that enhances of the strategic interests of the country, right, of the republic. The challenge is that we're dealing with a lot of old thinking, and like we love to elevate experts and we love to elevate representatives, particularly in our country, and that's becomes where someone walks in and you sit there and you go, all right, so this guy's the gatekeeper on Afghanistan,
right?
Like like that type of thing, and so we have everything has to be run by this guy, and so the challenge is that we get into this thing where we value experts over direct engagement, but Trump has turned that on its edge. And so I think that there's an opportunity there for us to really spearhead, regardless of what you think about Trump. The idea is that there's a spirit to figure out what exactly the regime, for example, the Iranian regime wants. I mean, the Israelis aren't going to like that,
right?
You know, they don't. You know, they that especially Netanyahu, I think, wants just perpetual. You know, his idea. He's a lot of old thinking. It's fight to win, keep winning. That's that, and there's no so what and what now from that. That's Netanyahu's plan. You know, when I was up talking, I never really got into the Israel-Palestine deal, but when I did talk with members of the AC, the ranking members I see, they would always say it's a hard stop because if there's a 2-state solution, there's going to be there's going to be a warm water port for our enemies, and that's the hard stop. There's no 2-state solution. That was what it was said to me. And I don't. Did you?
Oh, listen. When I was assigned to the embassy in Riyadh in 1991, the Saudis approached us and asked us to pass a message to the Israelis, and they said that they were willing to spend billions and billions of dollars to build a port in Gaza, an airport, and an electrical grid.
Right.
And the Israelis said, absolutely never.
Yeah.
It'll never, ever happen.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, you're like you're talking about the refinery in the Caribbean for Venezuela. You can't provide a port for Russia, China. It doesn't matter who. It's not going to happen. And I don't think they realize that. I don't think that there's any kind of the two-state solution was never on the table from a national security perspective. And that's until you crack that egg. What do we do? We would have to be in charge of the port.
Yeah,
which is in a weird way Trump's idea. It's so which is really peculiar. So I'm not endorsing it, but the thing is we would have to be in charge of it, or someone would have to be in charge of it, where it doesn't allow a port for our enemies.
Yeah,
and but how those conversations go. It's like, no, it's a hard stop. Like next agenda item.
right.
It's not even a discussion. It's just over. And
there are places around the world, like for example, Costa Rica. Costa Rica does not have a military. It just doesn't exist. There's no Costa Rican army. There's no Costa Rican, Air Force or Navy. They have a national police force, and they have a Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard, all it does is it rescues people in distress, and it does drug interdiction. That's it. Sure. So yeah. I suppose in a perfect world, you can negotiate something where you've got, a 20-year treaty or 100-year treaty or whatever, where there's some kind of disarmed independent Palestinian state in Gaza. Sure. I agree with you that we've probably moved beyond a two-state solution. It's probably, if it's going to be anything, it's a three-state solution, because the one-state solution, there's already one state, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so you need to have independent entities in the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah, and maybe float the Egyptian Navy over there and have them.
Exactly.
They're a reliable ally. Those things.
Exactly.
They're doing that with Libya right now.
Exactly right. Yes.
We're able to get petrol in and out of Libya.
Imagine. And it's only because the Italian Air Force is doing overflights and keeping the honest people honest.
Yeah, and that's it. So it's like, we love the Egyptians, we're trusting the Egyptians, but the Italians, I got to make sure that they're guaranteed it. But I appreciate you taking the time. I know
it's good to talk to you.
It's a pleasure to chat with you, and I appreciate it. Getting your eyes on this meeting at the Vatican. It means a lot. Thanks so much, Mike.
My pleasure. Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well.